Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Monday night, and it's the 1st of July in the year of your Lord and mine, 2019. Well, he may not be your Lord, and he may not be my Lord. It depends on which Lord you're talking about, but that's all academic. Unindoctrinate yourself, as Jeffrey Dougherty says. So we've been doing this series on the life of David. The what I would call, and what one of the books I refer to a lot is the real life story, the real life historical story of an invented hero. That's how I'll show you the book so you can remember. This is the book that really inspired me to do this, and I'm drawing a lot of material from his book. But I read this book several years ago, and it's The Historical David. And it's the real life of an invented hero by Joel Baden, who is a Hebrew professor at Yale University, Old Testament, Hebrew, easy for me to say. He's an Old Testament professor, and he digs into the life of David and really demonstrates how the story is an apologetic in the Bible. And so an apologetic, as we've been going through over the last several nights. I think we're on night number 10 of this story, which is a couple of weeks. Hey, Jeannie, how you doing? Hi from the Delta, she says, Northern California Delta? I know of the Delta. Okay, never mind. I get it. Northern California Delta. All right. Welcome, Jeannie. Good to have you here. Michelle, good to have you as well. And I'm just doing a little recap for those who are joining, those who may be watching this in archive later, that once again, this is the story of David. He was a real life person, a real historical character. There's no reason to doubt that. But the presentation of David's life, as we see it in the Bible, is an apologetic. And it's very clearly an apologetic. And we've pointed that out along the way each night that we've done this study. An apologetic is to make somebody look better than they did. And this is what the biblical story does. And we've been pointing that out night after night, event after event. And so tonight is going to be no different. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off, which was it's now David has gone through everything. Saul is dead. He's the king of Judah in the south. And now he is trying to get the kingdom of Israel in the north. He's gained it. And there's only a few people left that could stand in his way. And he's slowly but surely systematically taking them out. And I think what the apologetic likes us to believe is that David was this man after God's own heart, constantly pursuing God's heart. And he was somebody then that, despite being that person, that is the story that's told about him. He was probably just as ruthless as any other, ruthless, manipulating, certainly skillful in his, what's the word I'm looking for? His, not manipulations. You know what I mean? Skillful in his, for Pete's sake. Why, I've gone blank on one word. It's got to be, it's my old age starting to kick in. His strategies, I think, is what I was looking for. The way that he went about, he was a skillful strategist and knew what he was doing all the way along. But I think what the story provides for us, if you can read between the cracks of the apologetic, is a very real story of a very real king who was probably not a very good man. And so the writers made the story make it sound as if he was better than he was, just as they also, conversely, made David's enemies look as bad as they could, making Saul the king look as bad as they could. And so they had to make Saul look bad and David look better. David is this man after God's own heart. He's the man who doesn't want the throne, but he's been anointed to be in the place of the king Saul. And he will not lift his hand against the king. Yet we find he was probably there and probably instrumental in the king's death on Mount Gilboa. And And the same with, he made a promise before God to spare the house of Saul. And yet we see him systematically getting rid of the house of Saul. And that's where we're going to pick up tonight. And I really want you to, as we come to a close on David establishing his throne, we're then going to take off and establish what his kingdom was like, the things that happened. We're going to hit, obviously, one of the big stories of David's kingship, and that was his affair with Bathsheba, which produced King Solomon as his heir. But that story and how that story is an apologetic to cover up what he was like. Hey, Susie Q, good to see you. Glad you made it. We're just getting rolling. And good to have you here. And so this is what we're doing with this story. Now, I've got to recap also and just say, this isn't just an academic study for me. This is something that really came out of my desire to know what I believed. You've heard me say it before on Jeff's show when I'm with him, when we do the Consequential Rapscallions, when Rocky and I do our show, and we talk about some of these things about about what we believe. I don't want to be told what I believe. I want to know what I believe. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't all grow up hearing stories, having faith lessons taught to us of one form or another, or maybe some of us didn't have a faith lesson taught at all. I was soaking that stuff in. That's why I ended up in Bible school. That's why I ended up in seminary. I wanted to know these things. I remember as a little kid, I would promote God. It's almost like ministry was in my DNA somehow, that this was what I was going to do. And once I got into it in the denomination in which I was, after so many years in that, I started finding that we used to call it iron bars Christianity. It was Christianity with a lock and key. You had to do things this certain way. There was not freedom or free will the way we had been taught. And there were all kinds of questions we had with the scripture, but you didn't ask those questions. You weren't supposed to ask. And so that became a problem for all of us. And as I started to drift away from my faith, it was because I had problems with the church polity, with church governance, with legalism, and all of those sorts of things, and problems with the questions not being answered, or the questions being answered in such a way that I said, you're really ignoring what is there in order to promote the denomination's faith. And so those are the things that are really behind. I want to know why I believe what I believe. And so this is what drove me. And this is why I did the things I did and why I stepped away. And this is why I study this kind of a thing. So Susie says thumbs already. I hope it's those kind of thumbs. So this is why I do this study on David, because it really demonstrates to me how the Bible was written with a certain bias in mind, obviously. The Bible was written to sway you to think the way it wants you to think, or the way its writers wanted you to think, the way a religion wanted you to think. It wasn't written to present the facts so wide open that you could choose to believe God or not, which you supposedly have the free will to do anyway. But it was written to cover up the bad spots, to apologize for the bad spots, to present its best foot forward in the story of David. And I'm being a little vague here. I'm trying to figure a way to encapsulate what how I want to present this. We've talked about this every night, so you get the drift of where I'm going. If you haven't seen anything up until tonight on this series, you got to go back and you'll catch some of this. But it's unindoctrinating, as Jeff would say, one of our favorite co-hosts, somebody who is doing his own show out there. Unindoctrinating yourself sometimes requires going in and in a sense, reopening the wound in order to heal the wound and stepping back from it. And so by doing a series like this, what I am doing for myself is I'm going in and I'm looking at everything. And you notice almost every step along the way in David's story, I'm saying this isn't so and this isn't so. It didn't happen the way the Bible says it happened here. It didn't happen this. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. The thing is, those things did happen, but some of it's cover stories for what really happened in the event that they're talking about. So the history is there. The history is intact. What is not intact is, well, the apologetic is covering up to get you to believe something about those events in a certain way. So that's why I do this all together. I want to know things, and I want to know what I believe. So Susie Q says she has grandbabies tonight, but you'll be watching and listening. There's my thumbs up. So let's see. Who's in right now with Bauer? I'm not sure where Bauer is right now. So, and by the way, right after this show at 11 o'clock tonight, a little less than 2 hours from now, 11 o'clock Central, midnight East Coast, Rocky Stucci and I on the Situation Room. And we've got a guest tonight. That guest is Chad Lewis. He's a paranormal researcher, not just paranormal as a general sense. He's cryptozoologist. He started as a psychologist, getting his psychiatric degree and his master's. And then he went into taking this into cryptozoology, into hauntings, into ghosts, into UFOs, aliens, all of this stuff in that paranormal, underneath that paranormal umbrella. So we're going to talk to him about his research tonight. And that's at 11 o'clock tonight over on Rocky Stucci's channel for the Situation Room. So we'll see you there at 11 Central, midnight Eastern, or 9 p.m. left coast time. So let's move on here with David. Now, I'm not sure what's going on over in Jeff's channel. So we're still trying to establish a schedule where, as Jeff said, he's on at 7, I'm on at 9, Rocky and I are on at 11. So you'll find we're trying to stick to that, or at least get it as established as we can. It's coming. So he might have something special going on over there. I don't know. But let's move on. Here we go. We're going to talk about David some more now. And one thing that you've seen, we're accustomed at this point in the story of David, that every death that's accrues to David's benefit can also be laid at his feet from Saul, from Saul's son, Saul's other sons, Ishbosheth, Abner, the general that was Saul's general that established Saul's son Ishbosheth on the throne. Now, here's kind of what I was talking about in prefacing this tonight, is that some of this history may not be something you would look at and say, I'm going to study the history of David. I'm going to study the history of the tribes of Judah and Israel 3,000 years ago and how they established their monarchies. That's probably boring as hell to some of you. But what it is, it's a biblical story that we are looking at these events like Ishbosheth. Why does Ishbosheth matter? Ishbal was his given name. Why does he matter in the David story? It's because it shows who David was, how he gained the throne of the northern tribes, Israel, while he was already sitting on the throne of the southern tribes, Judah. And it's the manipulations that David went through to make this happen. The strategies, I guess you would say, is a better word than manipulation. And David had this gift of being this ultimate strategist to create the winds of change that he wanted to see happen. And he followed through and he made them happen. And he gained the kingship of Israel in the north and unified it with Judah in the south. So being the second king of Israel ever, he is the first, and this is about 400, a little over 400 years after the Exodus from Egypt under Moses. So after that, in that time, they have built this kingdom up, and Saul was its first king. just a few years earlier, 20 years earlier. And so it was only 400 years after they entered into the land that they started this monarchy. And now David's the second king, and he is the one that has finally unified Judah in the south, Israel in the north. And it's called Israel, the state of Israel, the kingdom of Israel. So, but we have to say that the death of Ishbal, remember I mentioned the other night that the two guys, it was Rechab and Baanah, they present the head of Ishbal to David, thinking this is going to be this great thing to help David because he's now gone after Abner's been killed, and which we find is probably a little bit of a manufactured, the facts are manufactured to make the killing justifiable. And these two guys bring him the head of Ishbal. This is Saul's son who's on the throne now. Here's his head. And they think David's going to reward them. And instead, David puts them to death for touching the Lord's anointed, as David said. And he would have recognized the value of the gift of Ishbal's head when it was presented to him. But this is one death for which he probably didn't bear direct responsibility anyway. So now, after all that, now here is David, King David, the title of this whole series we're doing. He's now King of Israel. He's got these unified kingdoms, tribes together. And the northern kingdom had no choice because its leading power was the general Abner, who had been Saul's general and who had been the kingmaker, putting weak Ishbal on the throne. Then he tries to turn the whole kingdom over to David in exchange for a deal. Well, David has him chased down, I think, and killed. And that's what we talked about last time. These men of Israel had anointed David king over them. And the details are probably a lot like what happened with Judah, as we talked about. The Philistines, remember, David's a vassal king or a vassal leader, warlord of the Philistines. He is not a Judahite or an Israelite anymore, which is misleading in the story that's written about him in the Bible, is that he was doing this all for God. He was doing this all for Israel, but he wasn't. He was doing it to save his own skin. And there was this another party that recognized David's enthronement as an act of aggression. And that's the Philistines, because he was a vassal fighting and working for their king who had given him a city in the Negev. And so the Bible reports that David delayed attacking until the Philistines entered the forest. He brings them all in, the sounds of marching, tops of the trees, and he attacks the Philistines. And he was a foreign conqueror, David. He drew the Philistines in to show them his might, and now they have become his greatest nemesis when he was a vassal state to them. David's a foreign conqueror. And although we think of him as emblematic of Israel, we have to remember he was not Israelite at this time. But now he's on the Israelite throne. So then we're talking about now Saul's descendants. Remember, Saul had David promise him one point where David cuts the piece of cloth off of Saul's robe while he's peeing in the cave, and then he also steals his spear and his water jug another night. And Saul recognizes that God has anointed David in his place, and he makes this great decree, remember my descendants when you come to the throne, which is just not something Saul would have done. It's part of the apologetic. So now with Saul and Jonathan dead, the war between David and the north decisively concluded in David's favor. And with Israel is now subjugated, Saul's son Ishbal is dead. His general Abner is dead. And so now David has to turn to the task of building up this now newly united kingdom without any further concerns about the legitimacy of his kingship. And who could possibly, at this point, pose any kind of a challenge to David? But he was keenly aware of how the Israelites perceived him. Remember, as he was coming up and he's raiding all this territory in the south and Judah, people didn't really like him. They thought Saul was justified in going after him. They knew too much about David. And no people willingly accepts foreign domination or infidelity indefinitely, and especially in a culture so centered on his kingship ties. A nativist movement was bound to arise as soon as feasible. And so the northern kingdom had known only one family as king, and that was Saul's family. And so it was likely enough that should any steps be taken to throw off David's yoke, the hopes of the people would rest with someone from Saul's lineage. But now we think they're all gone. This might be contrasted, by the way, perhaps ironically, with the constant desire of the Israelites after the exile in 586 BCE that the Davidic kingdom would one day be restored, which is ironic because what is that? That's about 400 years later after the Babylonian captivity. They want the Davidic kingdom and kingship restored. So no matter how spectacular David's reign, he'd never be from the royal family of Israel, according to the Israelites. And it was thus imperative that he find a way to remove the potential for a Saulite uprising, and to do so as soon as possible. So in the ancient Near East, royal dynasties had this inherent staying power. The patronage system ensured that there would always be those in high positions who remained loyal, even after a king and his family had been deposed. And so any faltering on the part of a royal usurper would inevitably lead to calls for the restoration of the old dynasty. So if David tripped up anywhere, everybody's going to go, hey, let's bring Saul's kingdom back. Even though kings were often seen as representative forces by much of society, it was better the king you know than the king you don't know. And there was just some comfort in familiarity, in tradition. It was harder to maintain a theology of kingship that the monarch and his descendants ruled by virtue of the divine will and were the earthly stewards of the deity when there was no continuity. And so the people wanted continuity. And for all these reasons, it was commonly understood that a usurper like David would try to eliminate as much of the surviving royal family as possible. And we might mention Jehu, who was a 9th century BC king of Israel. He murdered all 70 sons of his predecessor Ahab, and who's praised by God for it. God said, you have acted well and done what was right in my eyes, having done all that was in my heart toward the house of Ahab. And that's in 2 Kings 10. And any remnant of the former dynasty was a potential threat to the new regime. So one of the things I see, and this is also something that gave me pause in reading the Bible Chronicles, is that God seems to be just as human as humans. He was all for the killing of all the descendants to make sure there was nobody who could stand in the way of his anointed king. Now, does that sound like a God, or like the God that we're taught about? Or does that sound like people? This is what men do. This is what people do. They get rid of all the possible claimants to the throne and the descendants of the old king and anybody loyal to him in order to establish their monarchy. So they could rule because God had called them to rule. Well, you know what that sounds like to me? A bunch of guys saying, hey, let's invoke God's name. Just like all sides of a war invoke God's name in the war. So it's that kind of a thing that's going on here. And so that would bother me. So when I read into this, David was in this bind. He wanted to ensure that Saul's line would never challenge his rule in Israel, but at the same time, he didn't want to give the Israelite populace any reason to detest him any further than they already did. And he was already established as the king now. And to eliminate Saul's remaining descendants at the height of his new powers would appear to be the act of an unprovoked cruelty. All right? And so what David needed was an excuse to get rid of Saul's descendants. And eventually, he found one, as David did. Later in David's reign, according to 2 Samuel 21:1, there was a famine in the land. Now, famine was not uncommon in ancient Israel. The system hung by a thread. And on what little rain fell, the agricultural system, I should say, hung by a thread because little rain fell in the region, and it was a precarious situation. Any reduction in rainfall had disastrous consequences. There's lots of famines, frankly, that are mentioned in the biblical text, the Old Testament texts. And just a fewer inches of rain per year, and what was once marginally fertile land was transformed into virtual desert. And for the ancient Israelites, as for people throughout the ancient Near East, rain, like everything else, was controlled by the deity, by God. And the deity's decisions regarding rainfall were in turn tied to Israel's behavior. Israel, you've been naughty. Drought time, famine time, no rain time. Let's see. And thus in the Bible, we find passages explaining that the reward for Israel's obedience is rains in their season so that the earth shall yield its produce. That's Leviticus 26:4. And then again, Yahweh will open for you his bounteous store, the heavens, to provide rain for your land in season. Deuteronomy 28. So, but if rain was considered a blessing, then drought, along with its inevitable result, famine, was a curse from God. I will make your skies like iron and your earth like copper. Your land shall not yield its produce. That's Leviticus 26. Yahweh will make the rain of your land dust, and the sand shall come down upon you from the sky. Deuteronomy 28. Once obedience was tied to climate, climate was necessarily tied to obedience. Thus, if there was famine, it was only logical to look for the reasons among the Israelite people. And this is what David can take advantage of here. Now, it's interesting. I just have to put a personal anecdote in here that I was once buying a ranch, 40-acre horse ranch with 26 horses on it from an old cowboy. And there was a point where he said that God was not blessing his business, his horse business, because I did things like, as he said, quote, hunting them ghosts and flipping them cards. Because I would do paranormal investigations, because I was linked to people who did, because I read tarot cards, that this was something that he said God was not blessing his business because of that. And this is exactly the kind of thing that you saw in Israel, that the climate and blessings from God were tied directly to your obedience or disobedience as a people. And so the most obvious place to look first was the king himself. When the nation suffered, who could be to blame but the nation's sole representative, the individual in whose name the nation acted? For David, more than most, the famine represented a potential crisis. His claim to the kingship was tenuous enough, but now it might appear as if God had turned against him. And remarkably, however, David, or at least the Bible, found a way to turn his crisis on its head and use it to justify the destruction of what remained of Saul's line. Now, according to, and this is in the apologetic, they found a way for David to justifiably do away with the balance of Saul's line and lineage, who David had promised Saul he would protect. So according to the biblical story, David asked God what had caused the famine. God, what has caused this famine? And he received a startling reply. It is because of the blood guilt of Saul and his house, for he put the Gibeonites to death. 2 Samuel 21. Now, immediately we know that the famine is not David's fault, Boy, that revelation just got revealed to us. Boom. It's not David's fault. Remarkably, it's Saul's fault, who's already dead. And to understand why, we have to understand who the Gibeonites were and what the Bible has told us of them to this point in David's story. The inhabitants of Gibeon weren't considered ethnically Israelite. They seem to have been an enclave of native Canaanite population that was not absorbed by the emerging Israelite people when the Israelites settled in the central hill country of Canaan. And as Israel developed traditions about the conquest of the land under Joshua, in which it was declared that they would wipe out all of the native populations, the presence of these foreigners in their midst required explanation. Why were they permitted to survive? Was the question on people's mouths. The answer came in the story now found in Joshua 9. The Gibeonites saw that Joshua, now you remember who Joshua is. Joshua was the successor to Moses after the Exodus. So we're going back 400 years now, 400 plus years. And the Gibeonites saw that Joshua and Israel had razed the cities of Jericho and Ai in the first two towns destroyed in the conquest. And they hatched a plan to avoid the same fate. So they sent messengers to Joshua, presenting themselves not as the native Canaanites, but as outsiders, who were therefore not subject to the same destruction visited upon the Canaanites. They offered to be Israel's servants, and so Joshua made an agreement with them that their people would be spared. Soon enough, though, the truth was revealed, and Israel realized that it had made an oath of friendship with one of the peoples that it had been instructed to obliterate by God. Now, I would think, by the way, under those pretenses, false pretenses, entering an agreement, the agreement would be null and void. But the oath was sworn, and it couldn't be undone, which seems really weird, especially if somebody's lying to get you to go into an oath with them. So this is how the story of Gibeon came to live among Israel, even though it was not really an Israelite population. So now fast forward to David's time. Go about 450 years in the future. If Saul had truly tried to wipe out the Gibeonites, perhaps in some moment of nativist zeal, he had thereby violated the oath that Joshua had made centuries earlier, and thus brought about God's wrath in the form of the famine. You see where this is going? David therefore asked the Gibeonites what he could do for them to make restitution for Saul's actions. Their answer was predictable. Hand over Saul's remaining descendants so we can kill them. And David had no choice. No choice. He had no choice. And so he had to hand over Saul's descendants. He had to acquiesce. The fate of the nation was at stake. Two of Saul's children, though through his concubine Rizpah, the same concubine whom Abner had been accused of sleeping with, and 5 of his grandchildren through the eldest daughter Merab, were killed in Gibeon, thus eliminating all of Saul's descendants, all but one, to whom we're going to turn the story here very presently. Now, it would seem to me, if you think this through for a minute, David had the means to take Israel. David had the army to withstand the Philistines. But David did not have the means to stand against the Gibeonites, which was more like a city-state that was covenanted in to Israel. He didn't have the power to tell him no, to uphold his covenant to Saul. So you can see what the apologetic is doing here. The apologetic being written is that David is choiceless now because of this blood oath made to Joshua 450 years ago, even though they were lying to get Joshua to get into an oath with them. 400 years later, because Saul attacked them, Now Saul's house is still guilty, even though Saul is dead, of breaking the oath with Joshua. So now David has to turn over the rest of Saul's lineage. Now, if David was a just, good man, basically he would have told the Gibeonites to go fuck themselves. But he didn't. This is the story that is written on the top to cover up what David did. It's pure literary invention. Its roots are found in a different biblical book, in a totally different biblical story, one that it was itself invented to explain the anomaly of Gibeon's ethnic distinction from the rest of Israel. It depends on laws from Deuteronomy, narratives from the book of Joshua. It's fiction built upon fiction, and its coincidences are way too hard to overlook. Why should Saul's crime be punished with famine on the land of Israel only now, years after Saul supposedly oppressed the Gibeonites? Why do we learn only at this point in David's kingdom that Saul did so, instead of during the account of his reign in the Bible? Is it believable that the Gibeonites should independently ask for the one thing David most needed and most desired? Is it believable that David's one course for saving Israel from God's judgment of famine was the murder of Saul's family? Especially when David, God's anointed, promised Saul he would care for his heirs? It's starting to not make sense, is it? Even on a theological sense, it doesn't make any sense. So reconstructing what actually happened isn't a simple matter. We can posit at least one basic aspect. It was David who was responsible for the deaths of Saul's descendants. But was Gibeon really involved at all? Was there really a famine? Did the story occur when the Bible says it did? Now, Gibeon may have had a part to play, not because Saul had tried to eliminate the Gibeonites, for there's no record of this ever having actually happened during Saul's reign, but perhaps because Gibeon was never loyal to Saul. So nowhere is it said that Gibeon was part of Saul's kingdom. The city was an independent territory within Israel's borders. This being the case, the Gibeonites' assistance in this matter may have been a means of currying favor with David. We may even imagine that this story is the real explanation of how Gibeon became part of Israel, in order to ensure that David would not try to come and conquer them and wipe them out by force. And so the Gibeonites agreed to dispatch Saul's descendants and become part of David's kingdom peacefully, with the only people having to die were about 4 or 5 people. And others had recognized that eliminating David's enemies might be a way to win his good graces. Gibeon might have had the same idea. It's also possible that Gibeon had made some sort of deal with David even earlier. The battle between Abner and Joab, mentioned above, took place at none other than Gibeon, which, if it was an independent territory, is something of a strange place to fight. And note, however, that the Bible presents the setting of the battle: Abner marching out from Mahanaim to Gibeon, after which Joab came to confront him in 2 Samuel 2. It is thus conceivable that Abner, remember the general of Saul, who put Ishbosheth on the throne, went to Gibeon not to meet David's forces, but to attack Gibeon itself, to make it part of Ishbaal's kingdom. And that Joab went not only to fight Abner, but to protect Gibeon and keep it out of the northern hands. Thus, Gibeon's part in the deaths of Saul's sons may have been a way of thanking David for his support. So, as for this famine that's brought up in the time of David, it seems a bit of a contrivance, a literary device. The famine is part of the literary and theological framework of the narrative, It's this participating event for the entire narrative found in the first verse of the story, and the relief from the famine forms the story's conclusion. They did all that the king had commanded, and therefore God responded to the plea for the land. 2 Samuel 21:14. And so there's no question that the famine occurred in Israel, or that famines themselves occurred in Israel. But one that begins because of Saul's actions and ends because of Saul's descendants were killed by the Gibeonites is really a dramatically literary event. It's not a climactic one. If the famine is discounted, then we're left to wonder when Saul's descendants really died. The Bible is unclear on this count. Rather than date the famine relative to other events in David's reign, it only says that there was this famine in the days of David, 2 Samuel 21. This famine in the days of David, pretty vague. And we might be meant to understand that this occurred late in David's kingship, as the story comes almost at the end of 2 Samuel. But we can also conjecture that the author's lack of a specific timeline indicates otherwise. In fact, it strains credulity to imagine that David would leave Saul's descendants alive till toward the end of his reign, as a lingering threat to his kingship for any significant length of time. In the other biblical examples of a new ruler eliminating the previous royal family, the murders take place immediately. This is right after David took the throne of Israel. Of all people, David, as we have learned so far, was not one to permit any challenges to remain, especially ones that could be so easily resolved. Now, it's most likely then that David had Saul's descendants killed shortly after he became the king in Israel. Shortly after Ishbal was probably killed. But it was one thing to have participated in the battle that led to Saul's and Jonathan's deaths, where blame could be cast on the Philistines. And the killing of Saul's remaining descendants would be much harder to attribute to anyone else but David, as he would be the only one to benefit. Thus, the literary invention of the story of Saul's attempt to conquer Gibeon earlier in his own reign. David at Gibeon take responsibility for eliminating Saul's descendants, probably in exchange for a peace treaty. Now, finally, David could be confident that whatever else might come his way, he no longer had anything to fear from Saul. Many years after he had first entered Saul's service, the battle between Saul and David was finally concluded, and David stood alone. Well, almost. There's one more guy, one more descendant of Saul's. But do you get the picture here? Do you see what's going on? Do you see why this is an apologetic? Do you see why this is a story that is written to make David look better? Do you see that the famine was a literary device because they could blame the famine on the fact that God was angry with them because of the covenant that Joshua, 450 years earlier, made with the Gibeonites, who had lied to get the covenant. So they entered into it in false pretenses. But by the time Joshua found this out, the covenant was already there, and they had absorbed Gibeon into Israel. And so now Saul, after his death, we learn that, there was this incident in Saul's reign where he went to take out the Gibeonites. And in so doing, he broke the covenant that the Gibeonites had made with Joshua 450 years earlier. Therefore, God is now going to bring retribution on Israel years after this happened, and not long after Saul's death. Saul's not even on the throne. He's not even alive anymore. And so God is going to punish the land of Israel because of Saul's discretion, or not discretion, transgression in attacking the Gibeonites when there was an existing covenant with them from the time of Joshua, which Saul apparently didn't know about. And so, but they bring this up as to why God's punishing. The only way God will lift his hand of punishment from Israel and restore rain so the famine goes away is if the house of Saul is completely eliminated, which David has the Gibeonites do. But he remains, his hands are clean. He's not the one doing it once again. So, anyway, I'm going to just see if there's any comments here before we move on to this. Hey, Michelle, how you doing? Hi, Scott, I saw. Scott Dowers, good to see you. Oh, you're saying hi to the other Scott. Sorry about that. Sorry to steal your thunder, Scott. And let's see, who else we got in here? Anybody else that came in while I was reading? And nope, Susie Q. Everybody's been here already. All right, let's move on then. In this story, there's one, David's alone except for one person now. There's one guy left after all of this that is still of the house of Saul. And this is Mephibosheth. And one descendant of Saul remains alive. And it's not by chance, but very much by David's choice. David chose to let him live. Jonathan, Saul's eldest son, David's, according to the biblical tale, his best friend, had a son of his own. And the son's name was Mephibosheth, probably meaning the Lord is my master. Baal is in his name. At least this is how he's known in Chronicles. In Samuel, his name has been changed, just as Ishbaal's was. Ishbaal became Ishbosheth, and Mephibosheth became Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth might have been Saul's grandson, and thus in line for the throne, but he most certainly would never, ever have been able to hold the crown of Saul or to take the throne. Never. Even in the absence of David, because, for one reason, Mephibosheth was disabled. His feet had been crushed in an early childhood accident, according to the scripture, and modern notions might abhor the idea that such a disability should prevent someone from achieving high office, but it was less than a century ago that even Franklin Roosevelt felt compelled to hide the fact that he needed to use a wheelchair because of debilitating effects of polio. Even JFK had to hide the canes he had to use because of his back problems. And in the ancient world, though, it was even less thinkable that a physically impaired person should rule. Kings were made to fight for their kingdoms back then. In ancient Israel and everywhere in the Near East, servants of God, divinely ordained and anointed. And for Israel, which saw God as the perfect power between and behind all creation, imperfections in that creation were a problem. What they perceived as imperfections, physical defects. And it's shallow, but that's the way it was. That's the way people understood things. And though people with such imperfections obviously could not be eliminated, they could be withheld from positions where they would remind others of God's creative mistakes. You can't have a crippled king because then you have a crippled God. How about that? Thus, priests who served before God in the sanctuary could have no physical impairments. Sacrificial animals brought before God to the temple as offerings could not be blemished in any way. So too the king who stood before God as the leader of God's people was expected to be physically perfect. Consider the description of Saul, who stood a head taller than all the people, and of whom Samuel said, "There is none like him among all the people." This is when Saul was anointed. Or consider David, who, even though God tells Samuel to pay no attention to his personal appearance or stature, is described as ruddy-cheeked, bright-eyed, and handsome, according to 1 Samuel 16. So it's not that a physically impaired person was of no use to society. An ancient Sumerian myth called Enki and Ninmah tells of the creation of humans by the god Enki. We talked about this when I read through my book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, and also in the Reptilians book. Rejoicing in his accomplishment, Enki and the goddess Ninmah relax with some beer, and they find themselves playing a drinking game. Imagine that. I've just created the human race out of nothingness. What do you want to do? Let's crack open a few brews. And so they sit back with beer and they play this game. Ninmah creates imperfect humans, and Enki finds a place for them in the new human society. The blind man becomes a musician, the eunuch becomes a courtier, and the one whose feet are crippled becomes a metalsmith. This is essentially the same notion we find in Greek mythology, in which the physically impaired deity Hephaestus spends his days forging the weapons of the gods. Now, these myths, distant from each other in both time and place, agree not only on what the disabled man's role is, but also on what his role is not. He cannot be a king, even if he might be a deity. In large part, this was probably due to the fact that the disabled man could not perform the most important task of the king, and that is to lead the nation into war. Mephibosheth, may have been of royal descent, but he could never take on the principal duties of being a king in Israel. And the situation could hardly be more perfect for David. He didn't need to eliminate Mephibosheth, for Mirabal posed no real threat to him. Quite the contrary, it was entirely in David's interest to keep him alive. After Mirabal, the next in line could well be someone with the physical ability and ambition to challenge David. As long as Mirabal remained safe, however, the royal succession would be in a holding pattern. Israel might desire that one of Saul's descendants reclaim the throne, but the sole remaining heir was incapable of doing so. Spilled my coffee a bit. Keeping Mirabal alive also would provide David with another opportunity to score political points with his new kingdom. With the deaths of Saul and all of his descendants so far, David must have seemed not only cruel, but also deeply insensitive to the attachment that Israel felt for its only ruling family, which was Saul. Mirabal provided an opportunity for David to demonstrate his how magnanimous he was. I don't think there's a different version of that word that I was looking for. How magnanimous he was. David could stand up and say, "Look what I've done to the house of Saul. I've kept Mirabal alive." And David had never been anti-Saul, but that the previous deaths were merely the result of circumstances is what the Bible is trying to paint in this apologetic. So given the chance to display royal generosity, David could point readily to Mirabal. Look, I'm pointing at Mephibosheth. Thus, the Bible presents David as asking, is there anyone... This is before he knows Mephibosheth is still alive. David pronounces, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul with whom I can keep faith for the sake of Jonathan, his beloved friend? Now, no one could accuse David of seeking to obliterate Saul's name from history because of his care for Mirabal. This would prove his affection for the traditions of the North. So after the Gibeonites wiped out all the rest of Saul's descendants, David's like, is there anybody left to whom I can show love for my friend Jonathan? Oh, there's Mephibosheth. I think he knew all along he existed, obviously. So David summoned Mirabal to him. Remember, Mirabal, Mephibosheth, same person. It's an invitation that undoubtedly would have been terrifying for Mephibosheth. Well, the king's summoning you, and every one of your brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts have all been killed by the king. Now the king wants to see you. What are you going to think? So the last northerner to be personally invited to see David was Abner, the general, and who had put Ishbaal on the throne. And the previous heir to the throne was Ishbaal, and both are now dead. So Mephibosheth could have no idea what David's intentions were. Thus, he made his fealty to David as clear as possible. Upon arriving, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. That's in 2 Samuel 9:6. And in the standard Near Eastern gesture of subjugation, and when David spoke his name, Mephibosheth's response was equally abject. At your service. But Mephibosheth need not have worried, because David had no intention of harming him and told him, don't be afraid, for I'll keep faith with you for the sake of your father Jonathan. And then in an act of ostensible generosity, David laid out the terms of this faithfulness. I'll give you back all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall always eat at my table. And we think that that's such a generous offer until you pick that apart. I'm going to give you back all of Saul's land, and you will never have a meal that's not away from my table. The king's table is where you shall dine the rest of your life. And now, most readers, and I did too, I remember hearing sermons preached about the generosity of David, and they understand this as the true kindness of David. David's promising to care for Mephibosheth, even perhaps to treat him as part of the royal court. And David's actions are, however, less altruistic than it looks like on the surface, as you can imagine by now at this point in the story. By decreeing that Mephibosheth would eat with David always, David was in essence confining him to house arrest in the palace. Though Mephibosheth would not die, he would be a glorified prisoner, kept constantly under David's watchful eye. And this practice of royal house arrest is known from elsewhere in the ancient Near East. In fact, ironically, it's precisely what happens at the end of the Davidic dynasty. In the very last verse of the books of Kings, after the kingdom of Judah has been destroyed by the Babylonians, and its leaders are killed or exiled, we hear of the fate of the last surviving Davidic monarch, Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim, who had long been in prison in Babylon, was released from his cell and brought to the court of the Babylonian king, Evil-Merodach. And there, quote, he ate before the king always all the days of his life. That's in 2 Kings 25. This is the last king of the Davidic monarchy before the monarchy passes away in Israel. And the parallels between that story and the story of Mephibosheth are apparent. The Babylonians had conquered Judah just as David had vanquished the north, and there was no surviving administrative structure to support the return of the Davidic monarchy, just as there was no structure and support in place to support the return of Saul's family to power. And just as the Davidic monarchy would never resume after the house arrest of Jehoiakim, so Saul's line would never again regain the throne after the confinement of Mephibosheth. In both cases, the historical status of the royal house is acknowledged, but at the same time, a firm statement is made that the royal line's time has passed. David's actions toward Mephibosheth are only an outward show of generosity. In fact, they're a death sentence for the house of Saul. And so what do we have to make then of David's promise to grant Mephibosheth all of Saul's land? Well, this appears to be a kindness, as Saul's royal lands would have been quite considerable, at least by the standards of ancient Israel. Yet this too is very deceptive. This wasn't as much of a nice gift as you think it was. Mephibosheth, confined to David's court, could hardly take advantage of his property. In fact, David did something quite clever here. he struck a deal with a man named Ziba, Saul's former steward. David said, "You and your sons and your servants shall work the land for Meribah, and shall bring in its yield to provide food for your master's grandson to eat." That's 2 Samuel. That is, Saul's land holdings may belong nominally to Meribah, but they'll be worked by Ziba and his family, who are thereby indebted to David. Now, what's more, this arrangement means that even though Meribah is eating at the king's table, he's not eating the king's food. He is, in effect, paying for his own imprisonment. And again, David has turned an ostensibly kind gesture to something that is of solely his own benefit. And the fact that David had the authority to grant Saul's former lands to Meribah is also revealing. Traditionally, Israelite property was inviolable. It held in perpetuity by the family, clan, and tribe. Even if it was necessary to sell the land, it was to be returned to its original owners after a time. This is according to Levitical law in Leviticus 26. Now, Israel's territories were considered to have been granted to them by God. God himself at the moment of Joshua's conquest. And this was a cultural understanding that Saul never violated. Nowhere is it intimated that he claimed any authority over the land holdings of his subjects. David now, on the other hand, arrogated this authority to himself alone, in line with the regular practices of other ancient Near Eastern countries and monarchies. This must have been a shock to the Israelite population, who probably felt that their ancestral lands were suddenly in jeopardy of being seized by the crown. This is just what David did. He seized Saul's lands, manipulatingly enough, but and he made it look like something different, but everybody could see right through it. David's power was such that he could overturn this long-standing tradition without fear of retribution. This is the kind of power he had now. Now, given David's well-established tendency to dispatch by the sword anybody who stood in his way, it's revealing that he took another path with Meribah. The value of Meribah's life must have been higher for David than his death. And David's treatment of Meribah is this stroke of absolutely brilliant diplomacy. With one deft move, he elevated to prominence an heir who could never become the king anyway, kept under close watch his most obvious opponent, even if Meribah was a symbolic threat, financed Meribah's imprisonment with Meribah's own land, and created a dependent in charge of Saul's property in Ziba. And in all of this displayed to Israel his implicit loyalty to the memory of Saul's kingship. I mean, you tell me David was not a brilliant statesman. So, one final step now needed to be taken with regard to Saul's family. Now that they were no longer a threat of any kind, David collected the bones of Saul and Jonathan from Jabesh Gilead, where they'd been resting since the battle at Mount Gilboa, and the bodies of Saul's other descendants killed at Gibeon, and he brought them and buried them in the family tomb of Saul's father, in the territory of Benjamin. Now, this post-mortem repatriation was highly symbolic. Family tombs were of great significance in ancient Israel. They formed a major part of the family's title to the land. If one's descendants were buried there, then no one else could claim possession. The family tomb was effectively a deed of ownership. The tomb was also a locus for religious observance. In early Israel, there was this well-established cult of the dead. Living descendants offered sacrifices and poured libations at grave sites of their ancestors in the hopes that the deceased would protect them from the great beyond. So, you see, even in Judeo-Christianity, Christianity hasn't come yet at the time of David, obviously, but Judeo-Christian belief, the history of it, involves some very, what you might call, pagan practices. There was pagan magics, pagan rituals, all of this that makes the whole story of David look very different. The whole story of the Old Testament look very different when you start to filter it through that light. So it was of utmost importance that those who died be returned to their family tombs. David had every reason to want to prevent Saul and Jonathan and Ishbal, who was buried in Hebron, from being buried in Benjamin. Without the body of the king there, the claim of Saul's descendants to their land was weak. And more important, there could be no cult of the dead on Saul's behalf. As long as the king remained elsewhere, there would be no place for anyone to rally to Saul's memory. And this one physical location where Saul could be venerated would be empty. And now for David to be willing to return the bones of Saul and his descendants to the family tomb signals his growing sense of security in his own kingship. The threat of a Saulite uprising had absolutely passed permanently. Returning the bones would have no adverse consequences and might just score David some points on the political front. It was a prudent time, a prudent action, a gracious move on David's part. Now, from the moment of Saul's death to the moment his bones were returned to Benjamin, David had come a remarkably long way. Now look at this king you're looking at and that we're talking about now, and bring it all the way back to his days as a shepherd boy in his father's family, being anointed by the prophet to be the next king, fighting the giant as the story goes, but we later finds out probably wasn't him. All these deeds, the running from Saul, all these things that happened to bring him to where he is now, probably one of the most powerful monarchs in the region. He has become the king. He's come a very long way. He began as a vassal of the Philistines, a servant to the foreigners. He was a Habiru. He was a mercenary fighting for the king of the Philistines. And he ended as the king of a newly united Judah and Israel. So at every step, David took advantage of his changing situation. He used the powerful support of the Philistines to consolidate his rule over Judah. And he used his new power over Judah to confront and wear down Abner and Ishbal in Israel in the north. He used the increasing weakness of the north against itself, driving Abner to defect and Ishbal's killers to turn traitor. He used Ishbal's death to become king in Israel. He used the combined forces of Judah and Israel to declare his independence and to fend off the Philistines. He used both murder and diplomacy to control the remainder of Saul's line. David was a brilliant and ruthless tactician. Nothing he did was unexpected or particularly innovative within the larger standards of the ancient world in which he lived. He was simply good at what he did. And of course, attaining the throne and removing the threat of Saul's descendants was just the beginning. And we're now going to see and turn to this question of what David actually achieved while he was on the throne of Israel. What made him such a memorable king in Israel? And how did he create his new kingdom in his own image? And more importantly, why did the Davidic kingdom and kingship and line become part of the line of the Messiah, the line that the Christ must come from? He must be of the root of Jesse, it says. If you ever hear in some of the obscure older Christmas songs, he's the root of Jesse, Jesus. He's the from the line of David. He's the Lion of Judah, he's called. All these things ascribed to the Messiah. And in the New Testament, ascribed to Jesus of Nazareth, by his followers. So, what is it about this rule of David that leaves this impression that he was the greatest ruler, the most loving, kindest king in the eyes of God, the king that sought after God? We'll find out, and we'll go on to that in further readings on this topic over the next few days. So, I'm going to leave it at that point tonight, but I want to go back before I go on, and let's take a look. I'm going to go back through here and see what you're talking about here. I see something about 18th century phaser. That's interesting. Oh, you're looking at my background. Yeah. I have good taste in hats. These are my Penmans. This is one of them right here. That's not, as some people mistake it, not an Indiana Jones fedora. That is a Penman. It's a 1, 2, 3. It's a 4-point diamond, as you can see on the top. 4. No. 5. 1, 2, 3. Gotta hold it straight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 point. That needs a little bashing to get it back in. It's just a little bit out of shape. And it's a whiskey color, which has darkened a little bit over the years. It's kind of this goldish whiskey color. Love this hat. So, and yes, Susie Q, you got to love a Trekkie. So this is one of my Penman fedoras, and I think I've done this before. And these are all handmade by John Penman. He hand creates these. My favorite hat, of course, is the one on the wall back there. That is retired because, can I reach it from here? Maybe not. This was the first hat I got from Penman. I got to show you. It's my favorite hat. This is Penman's Casablanca, is what he's named this. This is the replica of Humphrey Bogart's hat from the movie of the same name. So this is the Casablanca. Humphrey Bogart wore a hat that was almost identical to this. And this one's retired right now because I wore a hole in it. But this was the first Penman I got. And I love this hat. And it's shrunk up a little bit since, you see it looks a little tight on me. That's because I haven't really worn it anywhere. It's been hanging on the wall for a couple of years since I did that. See the hole I wore in it. I talked about this once before, I think. It was from pinching it here when putting it on and off, which is the improper way to put a hat on and off. You don't grab it by the crown. Grab it here. And that's what you do. And you work the brim to where you want it to be. So yeah, those are my hats. I got that one. I got one more here. It's Penman did a less expensive hat that he called his Everyman. And this is kind of the same version of this one I just have on, just slightly different. And this is Penman's Everyman hat. And it's made a little quicker, preformed as opposed to all hand done. So he makes that one. But yeah, this is by far my favorite hat. I'm going to have to get this one replaced. I'm going to have to get a new one of these. So that's my Penman hat. Thank you. Looks awesome. So yeah, these are Penmans. And John Penman, a good friend of mine, he disabled firefighter, started making the Indiana Jones hat years ago, about 12 or more years ago. And as a hobby, and he learned how to make the exacting replica of the Indiana Jones hat. And now then he went into the Casablanca and others that he does, as well as you can see by the 5-point hat I have back there. So there you go. And we'll just set that over here for now. So those are my Penmans right now anyway. More to come. And no, it's not an 18th century phaser. But it is a good replica. It's the 2-piece where the hand phaser comes out of the top. But I've got it connected to the wall, so I don't want to take it off of there right now. So anyway, I saw that as I started to look back through. Yeah, Susie Q, you should get a Penman. They're fantastic hats, and probably the finest made hat out there. And they're all hand done. You can go to penmanhats.com and you can take a look at all his different hats that he has. He's also on Facebook as Penman Hats, or the Penman Hat Company. I think he is on Facebook. And so anyway, let me go back through here. I want to look and see. Let's see. Scott Dower says he would try to kiss Kirk, but that you might be charged with assault doing that. Can't kiss him. Get your own, Captain. That's right. Susie Q says her goal is to kiss Kirk before she dies. And she doesn't care how old Shatner is, of course. Yeah, he's 88 years old right now. Let's see. It's a Star Trek prop. Genuine. I'm going backwards here, so I'm reading your comments backward. So here, let's see. I might be able to get this off the wall. I think it's connected loosely. It's one of those. There we go. All right. And it's got no batteries in it right now. So there it is. And this piece, I've got a little piece of tape on it on the back here that connects it to the wall, but you can, let's see, I believe it's this right here. Yeah, that pulls that off. That's how they did in the television show, and then that's your little hand phaser. So, yeah, fun stuff. See, things work. You just can't disintegrate anybody with this. And, of course, it's out of batteries right now. And it's got all the switches that work, and this all lights up and all of that. So anyway, there you go. There's my grown-up toys we'd have killed for when I was a kid, and they didn't have them when I was a kid. Sad to say. When they finally came out with models of these things, they were enormous, oversized things that were ridiculous. So anyway, that's my phaser. I got a bunch of those, actually. And I used to have a bunch of other props, too. So it is not registered with the Federation. So it's contraband. Anyway. So, yeah, I loved the old Trek gear. And let's see. Sweet hats. Yeah, we were talking about hats at the end here. What do we got? We got 10:17. We got a couple of minutes to kill without learning ourselves anything. So I'll just go back through here and see if there's anything here. Playlist on David with Scotty's getting long. Yeah, we're 10 episodes in now, Brian. We're about maybe almost 2/3 through the David series. It gets really interesting in some parts. And I hope you all see what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying. There was one thing that bothers me about, say, atheists or deniers or skeptics. They'll go through something like this for the sole purpose of just trying to disprove the Bible. I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to say is that the Bible story of David is an apologetic, as you've heard me say a million times, that there was a reason it's written the way it's written. It's written to the faithful, to bolster the faithful of Israel. And so the story itself, I think what this does for me is it starts to prove for me that Judaism, Christianity, they're just two more religions on the planet. It doesn't necessarily mean that the faith story is the only faith story that matters. So, and when you find an apologetic this thick, like on the life of David, it pretty much sets that in cement, that thought. So there we go. I'm going to go back through to see if there's anything else here. Let's see. We didn't have a lot of people early on tonight. I think probably over on Jeff's channel. So there's not lots and lots of comments early on. They picked up toward the middle. And I want to thank everybody who's here for being here. Hey, Spartan, how you doing? Brian, I don't think I even said hi to you, even though I read one of your comments. Oh, thanks, Brian. That's good to hear. Jama, thank you for being here. Good to see you. And let's see, anybody else here I missed? Melinda. Yes, I am sounding better. Thank you. I'm feeling a little better. My voice is a little better. Cough is it's up and down, almost gone, I hope. So Scott says he might have better luck kissing Sulu. Oh my. Had to say that. By the way, with all the I wonder if this was done deliberately, with all the mocking that George Takei gets for that line and Sulu for the oh my line. What were the dying words of Captain Kirk in the movie where they did the crossover between Next Generation, where there was Picard and Kirk? Kirk falls down the cliff on this bridge, this metal bridge, and ends up dying. And when Picard comes and finds him, he says something to him. And what's the last thing Kirk says? His eyes kind of gloss over a bit, and he looks and he says, oh my. And he's dead. And with all the conflict it seems in real life between George Takei and Kirk, it's funny that they use those words. Oh my. That was it, Scott. So, okay, folks, I don't see anything that's standing out as any particular question for tonight. It's 10:20 right now. In 40 minutes, I will be on with Rocky, and our guest is going to be Chad Lewis. If you want to prep yourself for tonight's show, go over to Chad Lewis, Lewis, Chad Lewis Research, chadlewisresearch.com. And you can see all about Chad. He was, or he is an investigator in all things paranormal. His degree is in psychology, and I believe he wrote a master's thesis in psychology. And he brought it into all this research with the paranormal, with cryptozoology, ghosts, hauntings, aliens, UFOs, all these things. He's here in Wisconsin. He's within an hour's drive of Rocky and I, and or Rocky and me, and to be proper. And he does a lot of investigation work all over the world, but has spent a lot of time in the Wisconsin area too, seeing what's here. So we had him on or he had me on, to interview me when my first book came out, and back in 2012. And so now he was here in New Richmond, where I live, at the library, and doing a presentation on UFOs last week. And I went and I met him. I didn't know if he remembered who I was, and so I introduced myself and I said, "Hey, Chad," I said, "I don't know if you remember me," and he says, "Scotty Roberts," and yeah, and so we talked for a minute, and I brought my 10-year-old son who wanted to hear it, and he said something. He says, "Scotty, it's good to see you here. I didn't recognize you right away because you weren't wearing one of your hats." So apparently I have my own trademark, such as it is. And so it was good to see him, and I asked him if he'd want to be on the radio show. And sure enough, he said yes. So now in about 40 minutes, he's going to join Rocky and me and talk a little bit about what he does. It should be a fascinating episode. So come in and see it. So now I've reduced that time to 36 minutes. So I'm going to let you go. You can freshen up. I'm going to go splash some water on my face and try to stay awake. But it's a fascinating topic. It's the end of the day over here, as you can imagine. It's 10:30 at night. So I want to thank you for being here. Go to streamingtalkradio.com, Rocky's website, and in my website, that has all our stuff for all the shows we do, all the people we're affiliated with. You can go to my site, scottallenroberts.com, see all about my stuff, you can find the link to that through streamingtalkradio.com. Also for the shirts, for the Etsy page for Son of a Patriot. I'm going to have a shirt for this David series, hopefully this week yet. So I expect you, if you're enjoying this series, to pick up that shirt that will help defray the costs of my research time. As they say, if you want to get shirts, they're going to be available. So, and there's shirts for all different kinds of things over there. Mostly the patriotic stuff, a couple of the series we've done, and go avail yourself, see what's what, and see if you like what you see. Pick something up. And until the 4th of July, if you use July 4 as the code, you get 20% off of it. Anything over at Son of a Patriot on my Etsy page. So there you go. So thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for listening. Thanks for enjoying this, for keeping me going. Please like this post or this video. Spread the word. Share it. Help me build my presence here. I appreciate that. And we'll see you next time. We'll see you, well, first of all, in about 35 minutes on the Situation Room with Rocky Stucci and our guest, Chad Lewis. Other than that, we'll see you again tomorrow night. So thanks again. Have a good evening. Good night.